Hi everyone, my name is Danny. I make all types of YouTube videos, and for those of you who have been watching my videos, you know that I also make chess videos, and so basically I've been making this set of chess videos because not that long ago I purchased a chess program, and so I started recording some of the games that I was playing on the chess program. Um, so I don't want to spoil it for you guys because I hate spoilers. I don't want to give it away as to um, whether I'm winning or losing, or whether the games that I'm posting are wins or losses. But without giving out any spoilers that way, I'll say that this chess program has 10 levels. This chess program has 10 levels, and yes, I've been making some videos of previous levels, but this game that I'm going to show you right now, it's level 10 of 10 levels, level 10 of 10, and so, but as you know, every level has the option of being either the white pieces or the black pieces. For this level, this game that I'm going to show you, I'm going to be playing with the white pieces, and the computer is going to be playing with the black pieces. I also just wanted to also say that the chess program comes with different settings, and one of the settings is the sound effects, the audio effects. A lot of them I actually like, so I've turned them on. I've enabled them, and so the ones that I've turned on or that I've enabled are you can hear like crickets, you can hear cars driving by, you can hear it sounds like motor sounds, like a computer running or air conditioning and so forth. So those are all like sound effects. Also, um, the game itself has sound effects. So as the pieces are moved, as the pieces are captured, I've I've turned on all of those settings because I think it just makes things just more enjoyable. Um, okay, so let's just get right into it. Oh, I also wanted to say that I've previously played this game not too long ago, but due to the technology of the chess program, it allows you to save all of the games. It allows you to save all of the moves. So what I'm showing you now is I'm replaying the game, and as I replay the moves, I'm also going to give analysis, commentary, and feedback. So it's also instructional or educational. So as I said before, I'm playing with the white pieces. So I move my pawn to d4. So the computer moves his knight to f6. I move my pawn to c4. The computer moves his pawn to e6. I move my knight to f3. The computer moves his pawn to b6. So I just wanted to say that once b6 is played, that is considered the Queen's Indian defense. So that is in official chess opening. So as I said, so I just wanted to clarify that what's being played now is because once b6 is played, that is considered the Queen's Indian defense. So I moved my pawn to g3. That's natural. And the computer moves his bishop to a6. So I also just want to say that before I used to use a laser pointer as a tool, as an instructional tool. I found that the laser pointer didn't really work that well. And so now I'm decided that what works best is just an ordinary ruler. And so what you're seeing is just an ordinary ruler that I'll be using to just assist me in showing you guys just a little bit of analysis here. So basically speaking, at that point in the game, when Black is playing the Queen's Indian defense, they can choose between moving the bishop here, as he did, to a6, or moving the bishop to b7. So the bishop on b7, it's basically eyeing this long diagonal towards my king side. When bishop to a6 is played, it's sort of eyeing this diagonal here. So not only is it targeting my pawn here on c4, but it's also eyeing my king side too. So I decide to move my queen to c2 to protect my pawn on c4. And then the computer moved his pawn to c5. That move is a little unusual when it comes to the Queen's Indian defense. That's c5 is usually played a lot later. So I move my bishop to g2. So really, kind of what I'm doing here is I'm kind of saying it's a little bit of a trap, because I want Black's pawn here on c5 to take my pawn on d4. Because if that happens, I'll take my knight on f3 and I'll capture that pawn. I'll capture that pawn on d4. That will unleash this long diagonal. So my bishop will be attacking his rook on a8. And the only way for Black to protect that rook on a8 is to move his knight, which is on b8, to move that knight to c6. But once that is done, my knight here on d4 captures his knight on c6, and then he has no choice. He has to take his pawn on d7. So his pawn on d7 captures my knight on c6, and then my bishop here that's sitting on g2 goes over and takes that pawn on c6, and I'm forking, and I'm putting him on check, and I'm forking and capturing his rook on a8. So it's a little bit of a trap. So the computer thwarts that trap and moves his bishop to b7. So I move my pawn to e3. So I'm just supporting my pawn here on d4. The computer moves his knight to c6. I castle. The computer moves his bishop to e7. I move my knight to c3. The computer's pawn takes my pawn on d4. My pawn takes his pawn on d4. The computer castles. And then I move b3. So chess is always a learning experience, and I've reviewed this game a few times, and you learn from your mistakes. At the time when I was playing this game, there's different reasons why people would move b3, but for me, at the time when I was playing, I moved b3 because I thought that it would just give my bishop here on c1 a little more options, right? But looking at it now, those options don't really make sense. I thought that I could possibly give it the option of moving my bishop to a3, but that doesn't make any sense because he's got a bishop on e7 that's just eyeing that square, so that doesn't really work. And even for me to move my bishop here to b2, that's not really a good square because yes, it's protecting my pawn here on d4, but it's kind of stuck behind it, and so it's very restricted. So not really the greatest move now that I look back at it. And here the computer moves his pawn to d5. So I decide to take that pawn with my pawn on d5. So I decide to use my pawn to take his pawn on d5. So the computer decides to take his knight to capture on d5. And I cannot let his knight, see, if I, on this chess program there was rewind, so I'm just going to rewind a little bit. So after his knight captures my pawn on d5, his knight is in a central square. That's very, very powerful. So I can't just let his knight be on a central powerful square like that. So my knight has to take his knight out on d5. And then the computer uses his queen to capture my knight on d5. So what's happening here is that he's threatening here because he used his queen. Now because his queen came out, it's now threatening to. It's a threat to my pawn here on d4, right? But the thing is that when you're playing chess as a kid and they tell you not to bring your queen out too early, people teach you that for a reason, and you'll see that in a little bit. So I decide to take my rook to protect that pawn. by moving my rook to d1. It's a little unusual because people would say more natural is to protect that pawn with my bishop here. To either move my bishop to b2 or maybe even to e3. But at this point, I just thought that I just wanted to just wait a little bit before I committed my bishop. And at the same time, it's also developing my rook. So the computer decides to move his rook on the A file to d8. So now he's again threatening my pawn on d4. So at this point, I have no choice, and I have to use my bishop to go to e3 to protect that pawn. And then the computer moves his king to h8. I don't really know why he decided to do that, because his king side was under no immediate threats at that point. And then here, I move my knight to e5. So this is a pretty good move because it does a few things, right? Not only does it unleash an attack of my bishop now attacking his queen and x-raying past the queen, also attacking his knight on c6 and also his other bishop on b7. So basically speaking, at this point, not only am I threatening his queen here on d5, but if he lets me, for example, if he I don't know if I'm saying this too early or not, but here, I'm just gonna see what move was played next. Okay. Yeah. So that was played, so I'm just gonna rewind it and explain to you that basically at this point, like, if he were to allow this knight here that's sitting on e5, if he were to allow me to capture his knight on c6. Okay, let's just rewind a little bit. So his queen is under attack here, right? So there's not that many spaces actually that the queen can go to. So the queen could move now to b2, or it could move to d6. So if it moved to one of those two squares, what would happen is that my knight on e5 would capture his knight on c6, and then his bishop would take my knight on c6, and then my bishop would take his bishop on c6, and so I would be ahead by a minor piece, right? And so he's in trouble here, so he has to do something. So what he did was he used his knight to get away from that and captured my pawn on d4. So my bishop takes his queen on d5. So his knight takes my queen on c2. So if we look at the position right now, the position looks a little bit in favor of him because everything is equal now, right? The two queens have been exchanged, everything else is equal, but if you compare the position where my bishop here is about to take his bishop, but then his knight is about to take my rook, right? And so minor pieces, which include bishops and knights, those are considered 3 points, and rooks are considered 5 points. So if that exchange happened where I took his bishop and he took my rook, he would be above 2 points, right? So I decide that my bishop should take his bishop on b7. And then he does this really weird and strange move, bishop to a3. So again, after reviewing this game a few times and trying to figure out why he made that move, the bottom line is that move was a blunder or a mistake, and I'm just going to show you the next moves as to what happened in the actual game, and I'll rewind it and come back and explain to you perhaps why the computer decided to move that bishop to a3. So by moving that, once the computer moved bishop to a3, which is a blunder, this is what I do. My rook takes his rook on d8, right? So at this point, I'm ahead of rook because I just took his rook, point blank. I'm ahead of rook. So because if his bishop would have stayed on that same square on e7, all he had to do was just use that bishop and take my rook, and then it would still pretty much be equal. But his bishop is all the way down here now. If, for example, he decided to use this rook, here on f8 and took my rook on d8, then my knight here would take his pawn on f7, putting him in a check, and I would fork that rook. So, I mean, the fork isn't really that bad because the fork really just wins just one extra pawn, right? So, but regardless, the computer is down a rook. And so if he were to take this rook here on d8 with his rook, he would also be down a rook and a pawn. So then the computer decides to take his knight and take my rook on a1. And then my rook takes his rook on f8, putting him on check. And then the computer's bishop takes my rook on f8. And then I move my bishop to e4, and the reason that I do that is because this knight here is basically trapped here. It has nowhere to this knight has nowhere to go, so it's kind of trapped in that corner. So his only way out here was the c2 square, but now my bishop is guarding that, and so this knight here is basically toast. It's dead no matter what. So once I capture this knight, and I will, if I compare like the material or the points, I'll basically I'll be ahead by two minor pieces, right? So as I said before, a minor piece is worth 3 points. So because I'll be ahead two minor pieces, I'll be ahead by 6 points. And had he not made that weird move to bishop to a3, um, after the exchanges that would have happened, the game would be exactly equal in material. And I'm just going to explain why. So I'm just going to rewind a little bit here. Okay, I think that's enough. And so once he took my queen, my bishop took his bishop. And then he made that weird move, right? Bishop to a3. Instead, instead of making that move, bishop to a3, all he had to do was take his knight, take his knight and capture my rook on a1, right? But unfortunately, that knight there would have eventually been captured, because that knight has nowhere to go, right? But had that knight taking that rook, if we just add up all of the material, right? So I would have captured that knight, which is 3 points, and I also captured that bishop, which is 3 points. So I'm ahead of the game by 6 points. Had he captured that rook, that's 5 points. And remember, before he captured my pawn here in the center, I can't remember which square it was, but pawns are worth 1 point. So 5 plus 1 is 6. So we would have been exactly equal in material, right? So the other question is why did he move his bishop to a3? So after analyzing it, this is what I came up with. It was just a miscalculation, because basically I have two, if you will, really good moves here at this point. I have two really good moves here. And by moving his bishop to a3, he's kind of forgetting that I have those two good moves, right? So instead of just taking his knight and taking my rook and equalizing the game, right? He's moving his bishop to a3 because he's forgetting that I have two really good moves. So one of the moves is what I actually did, where I take my rook on d1 and I take his rook on d8, and then I win a rook completely. And then the other option that I had was remember, my rook here is under attack by his knight, right? So another good move that I could have made was just to simply move my rook here to b1, and then that rook would be safe, right? So I think the computer miscalculated and forgot about those two possibilities as to what I could do, right? Instead of him just taking his knight to take my rook on a1. And then, for example, if I had not made one of those two options, and I had made just a stupid random move, like, I don't know, if I moved my pawn here on h2, if I moved it up to, let's just say, h3, completely random move like that, right? What the computer could have did was, or what it calculated was the knight, that his knight here on c2 would have captured my rook on a1, and then my rook on d1 would have captured his knight on a1, and then his bishop, which is on a3 now, could have moved to b2, forking both my rook on a1 and my knight here on e5, right? So once I moved my rook to safety, it would have captured my knight. So I think that's the only thing that I could come up with. But of course, I'm not stupid. I don't make mistakes like that. And so we'll just keep playing and seeing how the game was played. So again, my rook takes his rook on d8. The computer's knight takes my rook on a1. My rook takes his rook on f8, putting him in check. The computer's bishop takes my rook on f8. And then I move my bishop to e4. I'm basically just blocking his knight on a1 from moving anywhere. I know it's good. We both know that knight on a1 is going to be captured. So the computer moves his pawn to f5, just trying to derail that a little bit. So all I got to do is just move my bishop to d3. And then the computer makes another weird move, moves his bishop to c5. We all know that if you have more material, you always want to exchange and simplify. So that's unusual to do that. And as I just said, my bishop will take his bishop. My bishop will take his bishop on c5. And the computer's pawn the computer's pawn captures on c5. And then I move my king to f1 because I'm going to use my king to eventually try to capture that knight on a1, which is stuck there. The computer moves his king to g8. I move my king to e1. The computer moves his king to f8. I move my king to d1. The computer moves his king to e7. I move my king to c1. The computer moves his king to d6, threatening my knight. I protect my knight by moving my pawn to f4. The computer moves his pawn to h6. I move I move my king to b2. So the computer just tries to get something out of it by moving the knight to capture my pawn on b3. So my pawn captures. I use my pawn to capture on b3. The reason is you see, black is very desperate. So black is just trying to somehow possibly queen some of his pawns. See, you have these two pawns here, the pawn on the A file, and there's a pawn on the C file. By putting my pawn in the middle, it's restricting these two pawns from moving forward because it can't really go past this pawn that's now on the B file. And then the computer moves his pawn to g5. So the thing here is that at this point it's a little bit of a trap where it looks as if I could move my knight here. So it looks as if I could move my knight, which is on e5. It looks as if I could move it to f7, putting him in check, and then forking that pawn. But if I were to do that and my knight got stuck all the way on h6, all he has to do is bring his king and go towards my knight, and my knight gets trapped in behind all those pawns, and then the king will eventually capture my knight. So that's a little bit of a trap. So I move my king to c3. The computer moves his king to d5. I move my bishop to c4, putting him in check. The computer moves his king to d6. I move my bishop to b5. The computer moves his king to e7. See, if I rewind a little bit, see, isolated pawns are not good. I don't really want isolated pawns, right? So I do not really want like his pawn on g5 to capture my pawn on f4, because then I'll have to recapture with this pawn here on g3, and then I'll have two isolated pawns. But at that point where I sort of had no choice, right? Because remember, if I rewind a little bit, like his king was threatening my knight here, and so I really do want to use my pawn on f4 and capture his pawn on g5. So that just keeps these two pawns here, my pawn on h2 and a pawn on g3, keeps them in a good sort of liaison, right? They're not isolated, right? But I couldn't take that. My pawn on f4 just could not take his pawn on g5 because it needed to protect that knight there. So once he moves it away from that knight, once he moves his king away from my knight, then it allows me to take that pawn. and then he recaptures with his pawn. And here I put him in check, and I'm forking his pawn on a7. So basically I do that because eventually here I want to eventually queen this pawn on the b. I want to eventually try to queen this pawn here on the b file, but the only way to do that is to get rid of these two pawns, the pawn on the a file and the pawn on the c file. So it just accelerates it a little bit to try to get rid of those two pawns. I put him in check. He moves his king to d7. So my knight takes his pawn. Yeah. So my knight takes his pawn on a7, putting him in check. He moves his king. He moves his king to d6. I move my king to c4. The computer moves his pawn to e5. I move my knight to c8, putting him in check. The computer moves his king to c7. I move my knight to e7. So now I'm threatening his pawn here on f5. So he has no choice. He's got to move that pawn to f4. I capture with my pawn, and he captures with his pawn. And then my king captures his pawn on c5. Then the computer moves his pawn to f3. I move my knight to d5, putting him in check. So I'm keeping an eye here on this square, on the e3 square, because I know that he's going to eventually want to try to move his e pawn forward, and at the same time I'm getting a tempo by putting him in check. So he moves his king to d8. So I move my bishop to d3. It's basically trying to stop him from moving his pawn forward to e4. But he moves it forward. It's kind of suicidal, I think. And then my bishop just takes that pawn. And then he moves his pawn forward to f2. And I decide to make use of my knight here. And so my knight goes to e3. I'm just keeping an eye on the f1 square with my knight. The computer moves his king to e7. I move my pawn forward to b4. The computer moves his king to d7. I move my pawn forward to b5. The computer moves his king to e6. I move my pawn forward to b6. The computer moves his king to e5, threatening my bishop. I move my bishop to g2. For some reason, he decides to promote to a rook. I don't really know why. I decide to use my bishop to capture his rook on f1. The computer moves his king to e4. So I moved my knight to d5. I moved it there because it stops him from attacking it. It stops him from repeatedly attacking it, and it's just more powerful in the center like that. And then the computer moves his king to f3. And then I move my pawn to h3, just making sure that it doesn't capture my pawn on the h file. The computer moves his king to f2, threatening my bishop. And then I just move my bishop to d3. He moves his king to... The computer moves his king to g3, threatening my pawn on h3. I protect the pawn by moving my bishop to f5. The computer moves his king to h4. I move my pawn forward to b7. The computer moves his king to g5. And I protect that bishop. I protect that bishop by moving my knight to e3, making my knight more active. The computer moves his king to f4, threatening my knight. I protect my knight by moving my king to d4. The computer moves his king to f3. And I promote my pawn to a queen. And then the computer moves his king to e2. So here I have to be a little bit. I'm trying to think here. Oh no, okay. So I move my bishop to g4, putting him on check. I'm just trying to restrict his movement. And so the computer moves his king to e1. So here I have to be a little bit careful, because if I move my queen to b1, it's sorry. Let me think here. Yeah. If I move, I have to be careful, because if I move my queen to b2, if I move my queen to b2, it's stalemate, right? Because he can't move anywhere on the second rank, and because of my knight, he can't move it to d1 or f1. And the other thing that I have to be careful about is that if I move my queen to h2, that's also stalemate, because again, he can't move his king anywhere on the second rank, and because of my knight, he can't move it to d1. He can't move his king to d1 or f1. So I got to be careful that I don't stalemate here. So I move my queen. I move my queen to b1, putting him in check. Then the computer moves his king to f2. Then I move my queen to f1, putting him in check. So the computer moves his king to g3. I move my knight to f5, putting him in check. So the big thing, the reason I like to move my knight there is because this square here, h4, this square here, h4, is where the king can want to escape to, right? And then it's just gonna, he can use that h4 square to try to escape. By putting my knight there, it disallows him from moving to that h4 square to escape. And I'm also putting him in check too, right? And the computer moves his king to h2 to get out of the check. I move my queen to f2, putting him in check. And the only legal move that he had was to move his king to h1. And here there's basically two different ways that I can checkmate him. I can just move my queen, sorry, I can use my bishop. I can use my bishop, which is on g4. All I gotta do is move it to f3, and that's checkmate. Or I can move my knight to, I can move my knight to g3. By moving my knight to g3, that's also checkmate. And I use my knight to checkmate him. So, this video is kind of a little bit longer than I wanted to, but it's like I said before, it's very hard to cut corners. It's hard to, you know, when you're trying to properly go through and analyze a game, you don't really want to leave too many things out. So I'm just going to wrap up very quickly and say thank you for watching this video. Thanks for watching all my YouTube videos, and make sure you hit that subscribe button and click on the all notifications button, so that you'll know exactly whenever I post a new video and so forth. And you know, every YouTuber is different. For me at this point, like, I just look at my subscription count, and if I see that subscription count go up on a regular, normal basis, that's kind of a hint or a motivator for me to make more videos. And so yeah, so if you want to see more videos, hit that subscribe button. So have a nice day. Peace out.